My dad, when I was born in 1956, was assistant engineer at Clipstone Colliery. The engineer was a fellow called Jack Booker, who was a bit of a character, I understand. Apparently my dad and Jack Booker had some raging arguments. And because my dad, being assistant engineer, was sort of the man on the job that got his hands dirty, and Jack Booker was more of the admin. I won't say he didn't get his hands dirty, but all engineers have to every now and again. But I understand it wasn't a very happy relationship. My dad was here at the modernisation of Clipstone Colliery, starting about 1951-52, and finished, I'm not quite sure when it finished, but they deepened the shafts from 680 yards, which is the top hard seam, down to 1,006 yards, down to the low main seam, coal seam. The top hard had been worked since the 1920s, and although it was the best coal and the thickest seam, it was worked out. They'd gone out to the boundaries. There were other collieries taking top hard coal as well, and Clipstone is surrounded by collieries: Rufford, Bilsthorpe, Ollerton, Thoresby, Welbeck, Sherwood, Crown Farm or Mansfield Colliery. So it went out to the boundaries. When it was worked out, they had to deepen the shafts and get the coal from further down, deeper. When you stood at the side of the shaft against the handrail and looked down the shaft, it was quite forbidding because it was a cold wind. I'm talking about the Downcast shaft. This is the one nearest the main road. The air, ventilating air, goes down that shaft, and so it's always cold in that shaft, and there's wind not quite whistling down it, but it's a stiff breeze going down it, and when you look over down the shaft, it was a 22-foot diameter shaft, about 7 metres across, brick lined with brick, just about all the way down. Well, it was all the way down, apart from being lined with cast iron tubbing when it went through the water measures. They had to seal it from water. At about 100 yards down, probably less than that. And then it was brick and mortar, and brick and cement all the way down the shafts, looked like house bricks. And it was really quite forbidding, looking down, because it was just into a black hole, and you knew that if you had to topple over, you'd be falling for 3,018 feet, 1,006 yards. What's that? 3/5 of a mile. The depth of the shaft, if you know Clipstone and you know the main road, the depth of the shaft is roughly from the headstocks. If it was laid out level, up to the top club. That's how deep the shaft was. And to get right down to the bottom of the shaft into the sump, Ruby's newsagents. That's what it would be. Going down the pit, I spent a year or so underground when I came out of my time. I was an apprentice fitter, and they sent me underground when I became a fully fledged fitter. I didn't want to, but I wanted to stay on the surface because I like engineering, machining, using lathes, welding, blacksmithing, that sort of thing. But anyway, they sent me underground for the first year after I'd come out of my time. And I used to go down the pit, and we rode the number one shaft, the cold one, the downcast shaft, the one nearest the road, and there were 2 decks of men got on the cage, so there were 30 on each deck, and you were packed like sardines. You just tight up to the person in front of you, or somebody behind you. But before you got on the cage, you used to hand in one of your 2 riding checks to the person who was going to close the gates behind you. He was the banksman, and he was the one that would ring to the winder, ring a bell signal to the winding engine man to let him know that the shaft was clear and that you could go down. You used to hand him, every miner had a round brass disc check and a square brass disc check, and you when you got on the cage to go down at the beginning of the shift, you handed your round check to the banksman, and then you could get on the cage. 30 of you, both upstairs and downstairs, and when you came out of the pit, you handed your square check into the banksman. This is a way of keeping a tally of who was down the pit. If there's any problem underground that they needed to know how many people were down there, they'd count the round checks and count the square checks, so they'd know who was missing, if you like. The actual moment when you started to move, when you started to descend the shaft, as I say, you were packed like sardines, men were chattering. Nobody really had their light on. You had your electric lamp fixed to your helmet. You had the battery on your belt and the cable coming up your back, and nobody had the lamp on. And when the banksman rang the cage off, which was, he pressed the button 3 rings, that meant men riding the shaft, and then 2 rings to say let it go, rather like a bus. When a bus goes, you hear if you have a bus with a conductor, it's ding ding and away it goes, and that was just the same when you're going down the pit. And you could imagine then the winding engineman sitting at his levers, and he pushed the big, rather like a signal box, sort of pushing the lever over, and you could feel the floor just begin to sink beneath you, and it's the structure outside the cage started to rise upwards as you went down into the shaft, slowly for a start, and everything gradually went dark and darker, and within only a few yards it was absolutely pitch black. You couldn't see anything in front of your face. If you happened to be on the top deck and you looked, you might see through a gap in the plate, you'd see the shaft, you'd see daylight above you. But it soon got absolutely pitch black, and as it got pitch black, the floor used to sort of drop away from you even more as the cage began to accelerate. And it went at about just under 30 miles an hour. It's not like a lift in a department store. It moved, It went quite quickly. You could hear the noises. You could hear the cage rubbing against the ropes, the guide ropes and the rubbing ropes. This stopped the cage twisting round in the shaft and bumping into because there was another one coming the other way.
In the other shaft?
No, in the same shaft. Oh. As you went down, as you start to go down, another cage the other cage at the bottom was starting to go up. And you'd hear that cage coming, rather like you hear a car coming up the road. You start to hear a sort of a roaring noise, a gradual roaring noise, and it gets more and more and more and more. Then there's a whoosh as the other cage goes past you, because it's coming up against the wind because it's a downcast, the ventilator going down the shaft. course, at that point you're exactly halfway down the shaft when the cage is crossed. You carry on going at full speed for a while, and then you gradually start to feel heavier. And the cage slows down to within a few yards of the bottom of the shaft. You start to see a bit of light because there are lights down in the roadways, where you get off the shaft, where you get off the cage, and you land at the bottom of the not the bottom of the shaft, because there's still about 200 feet further down the shaft where the ropes have to turn around and come back. The winding rope has to come back, and the overwinding gear. And if it happens to overwind, you've got to have somewhere to go down below the point where you get off, so that the arresting mechanism can come into play if they have a brake failure or something like that, and then you would get off the cage. The onsetter, that's what they call the person in charge at the bottom of the shaft. He would lift the chainmail gate up. I forgot to mention they drop a chainmail gate down, behind you when you get on the shaft, get on the cage at the top. They lift the gate up, and you would all trundle off and go to your different jobs.
Why didn't you want to go down the pit?
Because I'd always had an interest in engineering. Coal mining is heavy engineering, and I had already got experience working on metalworking lathes and blacksmith's forge. I was never trained as a blacksmith, but heated metal up and beaten it and made stuff out of it and that kind of thing. Using shaping machines, drilling machines, welding. That was what I really enjoyed doing when I was an apprentice, when I was on the pit top as a fitter, and we were out on site as well, repairing machines, repairing plant, making parts and going out on the site and fitting them, measuring up and coming back, making the parts and going and fitting them. And that's what I wanted to do. But when I was at the pit in the late 70s, the fitters, they wanted fitters underground. They didn't really want anybody on the surface. So anybody who came out the time as a fitter, they sent them underground. And it didn't suit me at all. Working in a tight space, working on a coal face machine, for example, moving, taking sections out, putting a new hydraulic section or a motor section in a place where it was only about 4, probably maximum 5 feet high, and you got there were certain things which you couldn't use. I mean, you couldn't have naked flames down there. I mean, we on the pit top we used to use oxyacetylene or oxypropane actually, for warming tight nuts and bolts up and undoing things. Rusted pipe flanges. You could put them in the blacksmith's forge and get them red hot, and then quench them in the water bosh. And that would make they could undo. They couldn't do any of that down the pit. You just had to. I found it just too difficult. I know people who took to underground work like a duck to water. Kevin Thorpe was tall and slim, not really the sort of person you would expect to work in a tight space, a coal face. But I worked with him, and I remember having to lift a section, a very heavy section of a coal face machine up, and how were we going to do it? He got a piece of lifting chain, put it round the lifting beam of one of the chocks. He lowered one of the hydraulic chocks down on the face, put the chain round it, put the other end on this machine, and then operated the hydraulic chock, lifted the arm back up towards the roof, and I swear that chain stretched an inch before the machine started to move. I don't know how it stayed in one piece, but it lifted the thing up, and also he needed to clean the two mating surfaces of the motor section and the hydraulic section, or the gear section, I can't remember what it was, before he bolted the two together. Imagine something the proportion of a Yorkie bar, all in square, all in sections, and they're all bolted together, flat, flush together, and you undo the bolts and you take one square off, if you like. Well, he was bolting this together, and there was coal dust and muck and in between the joints, and tightening the bolts up. They'd never come to they wouldn't join together. And he took one of the hydraulic hoses off a hydraulic prop, and he got what he called a reusable end, which was a nozzle, and he turned the hydraulic fluid on, and it was about £1,000 per square inch, something like that, and he blasted in between the joints all the muck out of this joint before he tightened the nuts up. I mean, the stuff that he was doing when he was with it was so innovative. I had the greatest admiration for him of any fitter. Lying down on the floor in muck and oil, and the heat, the atmosphere was oppressive. The ventilation, when you got, say, 3 miles out from where you got off the cage, the atmosphere by that time, particularly on the coal face and in the return airways, was not the sort of atmosphere that would sort of give you energy. You know what I mean? You know, like it is on a hot, humid day. Well, it was like that down the pit, but more so. It was some of the hot places you'd breathe in, and you wouldn't feel coolness on the roof of your mouth. It wouldn't cool your mouth down. It would just be hot breath hot air going into your lungs. I used to buy brown twist. You could buy black twist and brown. Brown was more leafy. Brown lasted longer. It didn't break up in your mouth, and you just rustle it around your mouth and press it together like a little piece of rope, really. Press it together with your teeth, and the juice it produces you spit out. And you don't swallow the juice. You know, if you do, it can upset your stomach. You know. I think it because I used to smoke then, and you can't smoke when you're underground, but it's nicotine, chewing tobacco. I was in an industry that was being killed off by the government and the unions, and there was just no future in coal mining to a young man trying to do his best for his family, and for his own sanity, sort of thing. You know, it wasn't nice, sort of working in a dinosaur that was just being wiped out bit by bit, the closing pit after pit after pit. Even productive pits, even pits whose sole production was going to, say, a power station or some sort of coking plant, and they were this coking plant, for example, was perfectly happy with the production of the pit, and the National Coal Board or British Coal closed the pit. Made this customer very, very annoyed. You know, he couldn't understand why the pit had been closed if it was producing just the right coking coal for what they wanted, and they could take all that pit's production. It had a good life in front of it, but the government the government and the British Coal closed it. UDM was a Union of Democratic Mine Workers, which was formed during the year-long miners' strike. It was a breakaway union from the National Union of Mine Workers with, I think, just the Nottinghamshire miners. The UDM wanted to break away from the militant National Union of Mine Workers, or rather the Knox miners wanted to break away from the NUF, and they formed the UDM, Union of Democratic Mine Workers.
So you were telling me about working 3 miles from the cage underground. How did you travel that 3 miles?
You'd walk from the pit bottom, having got off the cage. We actually we being fitters, we went into the fitters' cabin and got our toolkit. There were metal toolbox was in there, and you'd get what tools you needed for whatever job you were going to do, and then you would walk away from the pit bottom into the along the roadways. The area around the pit bottom was lit with electric lights. After quite a short distance, of a couple of 300 yards, the lights ended, and so you went along using your cap lamp. The cap lamp had 2 settings on it. It had a main beam and it had a pilot. A pilot was just a little bulb that people could see you, but you couldn't really see with. And then you twisted the switch and you got a long beam on and you could see where you were going. And it was dark. It was often better to unclip the lamp from your helmet and clip it onto your belt, because any obstacles as you were walking along, with your lamp being low down, the light would cast a long shadow on the obstacle in front, and you could see it sooner and warn other people behind you, because you tended to walk in a long line, lots of you, and you'd just shout, "Hold up!" And then the one behind you'd shout, "Hold up, hold up, hold up." So you'd step over a stone or a piece of jagged girder sticking out or something like that.
So was it quite uneven, the ground?
They tried to make it smooth and a decent walking surface, but it wasn't always. It was sometimes at an angle. I sprained my ankle one day quite badly going over, going down a drift, which is a downhill roadway. I've got a heavy tool bag on my right shoulder coming out of the pit, coming back towards the pit bottom, and I was tramping along, going down this hill, and my foot went over, and I sprained my ankle, and somebody carried my tool bag into the pit bottom for me, back to the cage, because I was in such pain. There's an underground road transport system which was universally known as the paddy. You'd get on the paddy, and it was an underground train. It was the sort of thing that you would probably pay money to ride on at the seaside, something like that. It was a diesel locomotive, only low and long. It might have only been about 5 feet high, with a driver squeezed into. I think he could get into both ends actually. To drive it forward and reverse. I may be wrong there. Actually, he may have only been able to drive it from one end. But anyway, he's squeezed into that, and it pulled trucks along with men sat in them, and it might take you for probably a mile. It wasn't allowed to travel at any more than 15 miles an hour, but I don't think I went anywhere near 15 miles an hour in one of the paddies. When you got going past 10 miles an hour, you really felt as if you were going fast. The arch girders were going past you really quite quickly, and it was certainly a second-class ride, but it was better than a first-class walk. You would get off the paddy when it reached the end of its line. And I remember there was a conveyor belt which would normally be feeding outwards. When I say feeding outwards, taking mineral away from the coalface to the bottom of the upcast shaft where they used to bring the mineral out. But when men were going onto the district, they would reverse that belt, and so you'd climb on that conveyor belt and go closer to your job. It might be 400 yards long, something like a quarter of a mile long, thereabouts, and you'd sit on this conveyor, or kneel on the conveyor belt, with your, you'd have everything with you, you'd have your snap, you'd have your tool bag and all the rest of it, and carry on up to the job. It was always quite awkward because they didn't used to stop the belt for you to get on, and they didn't used to stop it for you to get off either. You had to, it was a bit like getting on and off of a moving bus. You have to sort of run onto it and kind of be walking so slightly backwards when you got off it as well, so you'd end up standing still when you got off it. It took some doing. I ended up on my back a few times, just because some of the conveyor belts were quite fast. You used to have to skip on them and skip off them,
With all your stuff.
Yeah, with all your stuff. And then probably you had maybe half a mile or so to walk actually up to the coalface. And by that time, the condition of the roadways, it depends which side of the pit it was. The condition of the roadways could have deteriorated quite badly by that point. Either with roof convergence, which just meant the sheer weight of the roof had buckled the arch girders, so that you're constantly having to bob your head and move to the right and move to the left and walk with it crouched back, and then it might be okay for a few yards, so you'd stand up straight and then you'd have to bend that back down again. The floor was undulating as well. There'd be a conveyor belt running through that same roadway, so you'd have to watch that. You couldn't. It wasn't a clear roadway. Going towards the coalface, and of course there was no light. You were only using your cap lamp, which by that time you'd put back onto your helmet because you wanted to see directly ahead. And I would estimate the furthest we went at Clipstone was about 3 miles in, and then get to the end of the loader gate where the conveyors were. There was a road heading machine there, and you could get under the ripping lip to get onto the coalface, which you didn't necessarily do until you were called, because as a fitter you were there when it broke down, But then you used to do maintenance checks on the machine if the machine wasn't running for some reason, or if it stopped at snap time. You probably nipped under the ripping lip out of the loader gate, the tunnel that leads up to the coalface, and under the what they call the ripping lip up into the coalface area, and check the machine over. You may have been on your worksheet. It might have told you to check this, check that, tighten that up, do something else. Get that ready for changing. That was it. Going up to the workplace.
Were there any toilets?
No, not well. I think there were. The management had toilets, but I never saw any. If you wanted to go to the toilet, you just generally speaking, you just wanted a leak, and you go just about anywhere out of the way, because you've got to think really that if your job is on a coal face, that coal face is always advancing. It only advances 18 inches a strip. Like when the coal face machine has travelled across, it's a long wall coal face, so coal face machine has travelled 250 yards and taken an 18-inch strip off. Then it's pushed forward and it returns taking an 18-inch strip off. So perhaps in a day, in a shift, in a production shift, they might get 2-3 strips, depending on the machine. There were 3 strips and ploughs, or cuts and ploughs as they called it. You'd one end, it would, in one direction, the machine would cut the coal. In the other direction, it would be ploughing it onto the conveyor. So you'd have a cut and a plough, a cut and a plough. Other machines, they cut in both directions and they threw the coal onto the conveyor as it was cut. Probably 3 or 4 strips in a day per face. There were and there might have been coaling not only on day shift but on afternoon shift and night shift as well. So when you came back the following day, the coal face may have moved forward 9 or 10 feet, and over a week it might have moved forward 50 or 60 feet because the coal had been taken out and the face was constantly advancing. I never saw anything other than mussels.
Fossilised mussels.
Fossilised mussels, yeah. And you could break the grey fossilised or solidified sediment away, and you have in the palm of your hand a mussel about 1.5 inches long, which probably lived when it was coal formed 350 million years ago. And there were millions of them. Every when you put your hand through. Actually, this was down at the pit bottom, near where you get off the cage.
Were any coal faces ever abandoned because they were just too difficult?
Not while I was there, but there's a story that in the top hard seam there was a complete coal face abandoned for, I don't know that the conditions were bad, because generally speaking the geological conditions were not bad in the top hard seam, but it was a coal face. It had an early coal face machine called a Miko Moore. I've got a video of the Miko Moore when it first came to Clipstone, and it was one of those it called a power loader, because up until then miners got the coal off by hand. It's so this was one of the first Miko Moores. At the time, people would have given a lot to have in front of them a complete, Mark 1, brand new, first power loader Miko Moore. I think I only ever saw a blade off one, like a big chainsaw blade, triangular blade. There weren't any complete coal face machines, but apparently down Clipstone pit, even right now, somewhere in the deep soft seam, there is a complete coal face with a Miko Moore machine on it. Why they walked away from it, I don't know, whether it was a heating or whether it had, when I say a heating, whether it was spontaneous combustion, and they abandoned it. Although I wouldn't think it would have been that. Maybe it had reached its limit. The coal face had reached its boundary, and at that time maybe scrap, iron and steel made it, might have been making such low prices that it just wasn't salvaged. It was just closed, sealed off, and drove out another coal face. You know, there'd be one ready to go when that closed. I would imagine that's how it usually worked. There was a fella at Crown Farm. It was the conveyor on the coal face was a chain conveyor. It had a chain on the left and the right, and metal flights, metal bars, one about every 2 feet, 600 millimetres or so, and that's what used to move the coal away from the coal face machine down the coal face onto the conveyor belts to in the roadways to take the coal out of the pit. And the people on the coal face, to get along the coal face quicker, they used to ride the panzer. Now that was something which, you know, some people did ride the panzer and some people didn't. Those that didn't were rather horrified that those that did, you know. But some of these, the metal pans that the conveyor ran in had inspection plates. And I think it was somebody at Crown Farm, there was an inspection plate missing. Somebody was riding a panzer and his feet went down the inspection hole and the flight kept going and cut his feet off. The ambulance was often waiting by the shaft side. When I went onto the pit top, when I came back from underground working on the pit top, often, you know, we'd be going out about a business on the site. The ambulance would be waiting by the pit shaft. Somebody coming out.
Did it look different?
It was a coalboard ambulance. Yeah. One man on the paddy. I heard about this. I was working underground at the time, but I wasn't on the same paddy. But I'd spoken to this man, and what a lovely man he was. It was a Scottish man, a little Scotsman who had a lovely, mild, his voice just sounded. I spoke to him a few times, you know, and it was small, and they called him Scobie. Now, Scobie Breesley was a jockey in the 1960s and 70s, a well-known, successful jockey. And this guy was small, and whether his surname was Breesley or I don't know. But it was on one of those paddies that I'm talking about, and when it got to the end of the paddy, everybody got off, and he was still on, and he died. Yeah, I don't know what of, but you know, it was stressful on the body underground. You know, the general sense of coal mining that people get is that, you know, you're crawling on your hands and knees, you're sweating like a pig. You're not. There is some hard work, you know. You do have to crawl around on your hands and knees, and you have some heavy stuff to move and pull and lug about. But if you work smart, you don't have to do any of that. You know, you can get a lifting machine, you get someone to help you. You can. I mean, there's still a lot of people losing the finger ends and that sort of thing, you know. Just sort of injuries. But it was stressful. The atmosphere, as I said before, the atmosphere was oppressive. The air was poor. It could be dusty. It could be hot and sweaty, that sort of atmosphere where it just makes you can feel sweat breaking on your forehead and you're not really doing anything. You might just be walking along. There were intake airway. The ventilation was such that there were intake airways where the air was relatively cool, and there were return airways where this the air that had gone round the mine. People breathed it, a bit of methane in it and a bit of dust in it and whatnot, coming the return airway towards the bottom of the number 2 shaft, which is the headgear furthest away from the road. That was always warm in there and oppressive. With the atmosphere being underground, being so heavy underground, especially out in the district, when you're a couple of miles out, it's no wonder really that a person who wasn't feeling in the best of health, a person who was getting old, because they used to have to work underground until they were 65 in those days, but somebody who was kind of ill, if they got, a weak heart or something, it was no wonder that people occasionally collapsed if they didn't die, because it was stressful on the body.
So when you came back up, you'd go and use the baths?
Yes. You would, as fitters, we were allowed to come up the pit 15 minutes early. The colliers would be waiting at the pit bottom, and we sometimes got jeered a bit because we were going up early. We had to make our reports out, you see, and talk to the engineers about what we'd done, what we'd seen, what we wanted doing next, and that kind of thing, And then you get near the top, and your stomach will start to rise into your chest, as it starts to slow down. And you'd get up to the top, and you'd get the fresh air, and the chainmail fence would be lifted up, and you'd get off the cage. You'd hand your square check, your square little brass check, to the banksman who was holding his hand out when you got off the cage. We'd go into the planned maintenance office and make our reports out into a report book, discuss what needed discussing as regards, regarding the what work we'd done and what needed still to be done with the chargemen and assistant engineers, and then we would go across to the lamp room, take our lamp off and rescuer off, and go and have a shower. I think there were 500 showers in the pithead baths at Clipstone. I may be wrong. Well, put it this way. Yeah, to correct that really, there were 500 men all having a shower together in the pithead baths, and nobody had the slightest bit of self-consciousness. You had lockers to put your dirty clothes into down one side of the showers ran down the middle of the locker areas. The dirty side where you took your pit clothes off, there was hot air running through those lockers as well to dry any wet clothes out, so your clothes were all nice and warm when you put them on the pit clothes, and everything was dry. It might be crusty because it had been muddy probably the day before, but and then you would go through the shower, you'd have your soap and your soap tray and your sponge, you'd go and have a shower, and then go out the other side of the shower, and there would be identical lockers, same number, but that was the clean side. You would get to dry and put your clean clothes on, put your towel and your soap and everything in your clean side, and pick your snap bag up, and you'd come out of the pithead baths. You might go in the canteen for a cup of tea, or you might just go out and get on the bus, or you might just walk out to the car park or get in your car or get in your motorbike, as it was when I used to go on the bike, and go home. The people that worked on the pit top and the people who worked underground worked in different places, worked different hours, and they could have been in different worlds. There were people who he knew, who he didn't see from one year end to the next. People who he'd known when he worked underground, but when you were working on the surface, you never saw them that working underground, and they never saw you. Because there was day shift, afternoon shift, night shift, people coming on at different times. There was never, ever a time when the whole workforce was together being spoken to by the boss. And that struck me as really strange at the age of 16, when I'd been used to school assemblies.
So did you have other family that lived in Clipstone?
Yes, my grandpa Staley, Horace Staley, who was safety engineer here at Clipstone Colliery in the 1950s. Horace Staley was my dad's dad, and he had been an under-manager at Rufford Colliery in the 1930s, I would imagine. But he broke his leg and he was off work for 6 months and he lost his job because of it. They finished him and he came to Clipstone to be safety engineer. My other granddad, my mum's dad, my mum lived at Clipstone with her family when she was born in 1928. My mum was. They lived on the main road at Clipstone. I think they lived somewhere else in the village before then, maybe up 2nd or 3rd Avenue. I'm not quite sure, but they got a house at number 90 Mansfield Road. Now he was Arthur Ellis Smith, and he was, I think, a contractor. I don't quite know what they did, but he was in charge of a group of men which were charged with doing a particular job, maybe getting a certain amount of tonnage of coal off the coal face per week or month or what have you, and when that contract was fulfilled, they were paid. And then another contract was issued to get some more coal off. I don't quite know how it worked, but my granddad Smith was in charge of a group of men doing that sort of thing. He lost an eye underground. A piece of coal that he was hitting with a pick flew into his eye, and he, after some time trying to save it, it was eventually taken out, and he had a glass eye. And he carried on working at the pit, on the pit top. It was a little bit awkward actually, because Grandad Smith, Arthur Smith, was my dad. My dad was Jack Staley. It was Jack Staley's father-in-law. And sometimes Jack had to, give Arthur jobs to do. And my dad used to call him Mr. Staley. And I had to pussyfoot round him a bit, because it was a come down for my granddad to have to sort of work on the pit top after he'd worked underground and been earning good money. After they were earning better money than they were on the pit top. My granddad, Arthur Smith, took a job as an instructor at Lound Hall Training Centre. He retired in 1967. He had dust, pneumoconiosis. He had emphysema, and all the time I knew my granddad, he sounded like an aqualung when he was breathing. really deep breaths, and he had that pain look, that sort of can't get his breath look, expression on his face that typifies emphysema sufferers. He survived 2 years and died at the age of 67. Arthur, my granddad, and his wife had Sylvia, Margaret, Rex and Molly. Rex, who was a bit of a black sheep in the family, a mixed blessing as my dad used to call him, he was the only man that I know who was born in the same house that he died in. Number 90 Mansfield Road. And he also lost an eye, but it was out in the field. He was an outdoorsman. He liked hunting, shooting and fishing, and the story goes that he stumbled over a fence into a thorn bush, and he lost, I think it was his right eye, the same eye that his father had lost, and it would have been about the same age. And Rex also died at the age of 67, same age as his dad did.